Old friends, new friends, all friends. Christmas is creeping up on us, and so I wanted to share the story of the Christmas clown. Now, I know that some people don't like clowns. In fact, some people hate clowns. But every time I see a clown or a picture of a clown, I get a happy feeling. And this all started 57 years ago. I was 14 years old, and it had been a hard year. The Norris family, you could call the family a clan. We were very close-knit, and while we might argue and quarrel with each other, if anybody from the outside criticized or attacked a family member, woe be unto that person. The clan rallied around. But we had never had, in my experience, a death in the family up until I was 14. And that year my grandfather died. And grandfather, Ben Norris, was a tall man. He was a quiet man. He didn't say much, but when he did say something, you listened to him. I remember one Christmas, one of my cousins, a young girl just a little older than me, had received a doll. And she liked the doll, but she didn't like the dress it was wearing. And she said, "Oh, I wish it had had a pink dress instead of a green dress." And Grandpa Norris put his arm around her and he said, "Honey, it's not what you want makes you fat, it's what you eat." And she was so confounded by what he said, as I was, that she wandered off and quit crying. It was only years later that I realized what Grandpa had meant by that. It's not what you want makes you fat, it's what you eat, it's what you get. Well, I was 14, and in addition to losing Grandpa, who was the patriarch of the family, my father was sick. About a year before, a rash had come on his right thigh, and it didn't seem consequential, but it wouldn't go away. And it kept growing, and he went to the doctor to see about it. "Oh, it's nothing." He just gave him some cream, some Desonex to put on it. But it kept growing, and it got bigger, and it got raised from the skin, and then it started to weep and bleed, and he had to put a bandage on it and go back to the doctor. "Well, we don't know what it is, but we think it'll clear up." Well, by the time I was 14, it was sapping his energy, and it was obviously making him very sick. They still didn't know what it could be that was causing it. But that was 1963, and I'm thinking about late September on a Saturday when the carnival had come to town. Now, the carnival coming to a little eastern Kentucky town like McKee was a big deal. It was a big deal for me. I loved it. I loved all the rides and the games and the food and the carnies that seemed to have a kind of a weary wisdom about them. They knew something that we didn't know. They had been places that we hadn't been. They knew secrets that we hadn't been entered into. Years later, I realized that some of those places and some of those secrets were just things I just assumed not have experienced. But it was Saturday. The carnival had been open since Monday, and that was the last day. And we had just eaten supper, and I really wanted to go to the carnival. And Dad was in the living room sitting on the couch looking at the paper. I said, can we go up to the carnival? And he looked up at me. I could tell that he knew that I really wanted to go. But he had a sad look on his face. He said, "Mike, I just don't feel like it. I feel bad." And so I let it go, and I went in the kitchen and I asked Mother, I said, "Mother, could you take me up to the carnival?" And she was in a little bit of a bad mood because she said no. She said, "Things have piled up all week during the house. Nobody helps me around here. Get your daddy to take you up there." So I waited a few minutes, and then I ventured back into the living room, and I said, "Dad, could we go up to the carnival for just a little while?" And he looked at me again, and he kind of sighed, and he said, "Okay, but not long." So we went out and got in the 1952 Willis Jeep and drove up through McKee and drove up to the ballpark, and we parked way, way, way down in right field where we would play baseball because it was full of cars. And as we walked up there it was. The baseball field had been transformed into a kind of a wonderland of yellow and red and blue and green lights and noise and crowds of people and smells of food, and behind it all the Ferris wheel going around, rotating that white light. So we went up there, and when we got onto the infield where the main things were, Daddy said, now you can get you one thing to eat, and then we'll do one thing, and then I've got to go. So my two favorites were cotton candy and elephant ears, but it wasn't really a close contest. The cotton candy won, and I got some cotton candy, and I was eating it. I remember how good it tasted. I just would have the thought, I can't believe anything tastes like this. But he said, okay, now what do you want to do? Well, I looked around at the rides. Of course, we had a merry-go-round. Now, a merry-go-round was a funny kind of a ride because there was an age restriction on it. This was unspoken, but if you were a young child, it was fine to ride the merry-go-round. And if you were an older boy or girl, say a senior in high school, and you were dating a girl or a boy and you rode the merry-go-round together, that was okay too. But if you were anywhere from about 7 to 16, you'd rather be dead than caught on the merry-go-round. Well, we also had a Ferris wheel, as I said, and that Ferris wheel that would go around, this had a romantic component to it as well. Girls and boys would ride in that seat together a lot of times, and it seemed like about every other time it would get stuck. That machinery malfunctioned regularly, and that couple, it would always be that couple, they would get stuck at the top for a few minutes. And the more the machine malfunctioned, the more people wanted to ride it. Well, we had that. We had bumper cars, and you'd be surprised how that could jolt you when somebody gave you a direct hit, and they would give you a direct hit. Then we had a Wildcat, which was a little mini roller coaster, and it wasn't very high off the ground, but it had steep curves and it went really fast. And if you ever saw how quickly they put it together on the Sunday before Carnival opened, and how many bolts maybe they left off, you'd realize that it was scary enough indeed. And then we had a ride called the Roundup, which was a round wall and that spun in a circle real fast. You would stand around the wall, and when it got to spinning sufficiently so that the centrifugal force would push you back against the wall, the floor would drop away. Well, that would get your heart beating. And then the last one we had was the one that interested me most of all. That was the tilt-a-whirl. And again, the tilt-a-whirl offered romantic possibilities. You know probably what a tilt-a-whirl is. It's a big circular platform with a wall around it, and it spins around, but as it spins, it wobbles. Of course, and on it are these little cars, round cars, and they also spin in their own little circle and wobble. And if you got a girl to go on the tilt-a-whirl with you, you might start out sitting a little bit apart, but you might end up very much together. She might even end up on your lap. That had been known to happen with some regularity. And this was wonderful because here was this close contact at the end of the ride, but nobody was responsible. It was all because of gravity and centrifugal force. So here was contact without responsibility. And that was a concept that would get even more popular in the 70s and in subsequent decades. But those were the rides. But I didn't really want to do a ride because I knew Dad probably wouldn't do it with me. So I looked around at some of these games of chance. There was darts where you threw a dart at a balloon, and they'd always have a fan on those little balloons tied onto the board so they moved, and you'd be surprised at how much harder that made them to hit. And then they would have the dummies, the dolls with fuzz around them, and you'd throw a softball at that. And of course, if you hit that fuzz, you wouldn't knock it down, and you typically lost, which was the whole idea. Then they had a thing called the nickel toss, where there was a big square fence, and in the middle of it was a grid with little squares painted in black, just a little bit bigger than a nickel, and around it was a trough. And you had to toss your nickel over and get it on that board, and if you got it in that square, not touching any of the black, you won a little prize. And if you wanted to keep paying and playing till you got 3, you won a big prize. Well, I remember the guy that really broke that game was Jewel Gabbard. He ended up marrying my cousin, Joanne Norris. And Jewel watched it very carefully before he played, and he realized that most people, at least half of the nickels slid off the board and didn't even have a chance of winning. So Jewel got a pocket full of nickels, but before he'd throw it, he had wet it a little bit, and he had tossed it. His never went off the board. And before you know it, he had won the biggest teddy bear they had, and he kept on playing. And then he won this giant giraffe, and he kept on playing, and then he won this giant rabbit. And then they banned Jewel from the nickel toss, and that just increased to the admiration we all had to him. Now, you may think that putting those nickels in his mouth would have compromised his health, but it didn't seem to do a thing. He worked out well. Well, I was looking around. I guess I get to do one thing. What do I want to do? I didn't want to do any of the tosses or even the basketball shoot because I didn't think Daddy would do it. But over there on the corner, right around third base where I used to play in Little League, there was a booth, and it said, "Guess your age and weight within 3 or you win." And it was 50 cents a try. And I told Dad, I said, I want us to do that. He said, okay. We went over, and he gave the man $1, and the man said, okay, who wants to go first? And Daddy says, you go first. And I said, okay. And the man said, you want me to guess your age or your weight? Well, I never ended up being a math major, but I knew he'd have a harder time guessing my weight than my age, so I said my weight. So he walked around me and looked me over up and down, and then he said, 125 pounds. And then he pointed down to a little scale on a piece of plywood, and I stepped on it. 130 pounds. He was 5 off. You win, he said. All right. So he looked at Dad, and Dad said, you guess my age. So the man looked Dad over, and he walked around him, and he said, now I'm going to need to see some kind of ID. And Dad said, well, that's fine. He looked him over, and then the man wrote down a number on a piece of paper and folded it over so we couldn't see. And he said, okay, how old are you? And Dad pulled out his billfold and kind of flashed his driver's license. He said, I'm 43 years old. The man said, you win. You both win. And Daddy said, well, how old did you guess I was? And the man said, no, I was off. That's all right. You win. But Daddy insisted, and he kept on. He said, no, I want to know how old you thought I was. And the man reluctantly unfolded the paper, and there it was. He had guessed that Daddy was 51 years old because he was sick, and he didn't look good. He looked that old. So he said, pick out 2 prizes. Now, what they had for prizes were not stuffed animals or teddy bears, that kind of thing. They were chalk figures, and they had all kinds of figures. They had a Popeye, and they had a Lone Ranger. They had one as a windmill. They had a collie dog, but I knew immediately what I wanted. There were 2 clowns side by side, and they were just the same except they were painted differently. One of them was pink, and one of them was yellow. I said, I want those 2 clowns. So he gave them to me. We went back down to the Willis Jeep, and I went home with my 2 clowns that Dad and I had won. Well, I went in my bedroom, and in the little 2-bedroom house we lived in, the rooms were very small. I went back there recently, and they were even smaller than I remembered them. But in my bedroom, I had a kind of a tall bed, but at the end of it, there wasn't really room for a dresser, but Mother had found an antique dresser in Dry Ridge in Jackson County on a porch, and she had bought it for $10 and refinished it. And she put it in my bedroom at the foot of the bed. And on either side, it had a box. And some people would call them a wig box, and some people would call them a jewelry box. But they sat right up next to the foot of my bed, and I put the pink clown on the one to my left and the yellow clown on the one to my right. And there they sat for years and years and years. And every time I looked at them, I got a little happy feeling, remembering that time that Dad and I went to the park. And they helped me in other ways too, because they had slots on their back, and they served as piggy banks too, and I would put some money in there. But there was no hole at the bottom. But I figured out that if you really needed the money, for example, if there was a new Superman comic book, a 25-cent issue that was 3 times as big as a 10-cent issue that I really needed, if I laid on my back on the bed and shook it just right, or sometimes you even had to get a kitchen knife, you could get that money out of there when you needed it. So the clowns provided a little financial support in addition to their emotional support. And it was a good thing I had that, because the next 2 years were rougher still. The place that had come on Daddy's leg continued to grow, and then another place appeared on his left thigh. And it began to, the other one was growing, and it was getting more severe and affecting his health. And in my junior year in high school, about halfway through, he had to quit teaching history and coaching basketball and baseball. He just couldn't do it. And he had been going to the UK Med Center, and finally they diagnosed what he had as a rare form of skin cancer. And at that time, when you heard the word skin cancer in any form, it was not like today. It was pretty much a death sentence. And when I heard through one of my uncles that my dad never told me directly, but that my dad had cancer, it was like I could see the horizon, and there was the road, and then there was the hills, and then there was the sky. And it was like black ink. I could see that black ink start coming down from the sky, and it blackened the whole horizon. So that was a very, very hard time, and Dad's health just continued to get worse and worse and worse. And at the end of July in 1965, he went into a coma. And when he went into a coma, people started coming, as they will in the hills, to the house, and just kind of standing around in the yard, keeping vigil. And they talked in quiet voices. And after about, on the 3rd night, I was in my bedroom, and I couldn't go to sleep. But I heard some noise at the front of the house, and some people were coming in the house, and then I heard a step, sort of a clank step, and I knew that that was one of the men from the funeral home who had had polio, and he wore a steel brace on one leg. And I knew that my father was dead. And that was a long, hard night and a long, hard time. Well, it wasn't long until my senior year in high school began, and that was a strange year. It was a good year and a bad year. It was a good year in that I was doing well in my studies. I was doing well on the baseball team. I couldn't run very fast, but I played first base, and I could catch it, and that was the main thing. And even in basketball, I did pretty well because I could shoot it if they would leave me alone. But they typically didn't. They called it defense. But still, things were going bad. In basketball, we beat our arch rival, the Tyner Cardinals, for the first time in several years. But my dad, who'd been the coach, wasn't there to see it. He wasn't there to see anything. And so it seemed kind of like a cruel joke. When things would go good, they would be bittersweet at the best. But then I graduated and went off to school at Eastern and got involved in things there. Got involved in music, started playing in a band. And when I was a sophomore, I was invited to join a band called the Ovations that I had watched earlier over in London when I got my driver's license. Me and my buddy Leslie would go over to hear them. Well, they invited me to join, and we played at the Congress Inn 6 nights a week for a year. And then other things distracted my interest. There were opportunities that I'll call tilt-a-whirl opportunities. And before long, in my senior year, I was married. And of course, I would continue to go back to McKee. And by then, my mother had remarried. But always when I went to the house, as soon as I said hello to people, I would go in the bedroom and look at my clowns. And there they were, the pink clown and the yellow clown, sitting on that walnut dresser. Now, my bedroom was starting to get a little stacked up because my mother didn't throw things away. Not only did she not throw the thing away, but she didn't throw the box it came in away either. But every time I would go in and check on the clowns, and they would still be there. Well, before long I graduated from Eastern, and then I started teaching English at Brea Community School. And before long, we had a little baby, a little girl named Carrie, who some of you all know, I realize. And we'd come back to visit, and still the clowns would be there. The room would be a little fuller. But after 2 years, we decided to move to Columbia, South Carolina, so I could go to graduate school. James Dickey was down there, and William Price Fox, and it was a sort of exciting time. Turned out to be a kind of a rough time, but we stayed down there 6 years. But still, we would get back, and every time I'd run in to check on the clowns. By the time we were in South Carolina, the space under the bed had been filled with boxes, and the bed itself had been covered with boxes, and there were a few boxes on the floor, but the clowns were still there keeping vigil. So we went back, and that continued for a number of years. But after a while, Mother's second husband passed away, and she was a widow for the second time, and we visited a little more often. But one visit in the 90s, after Mother had been widowed again, we came up for a visit. And after I had said hello, I went into my bedroom. And there on the walnut dresser, instead of the clowns, were boxes, and the clowns were gone. And I came into Mother, and I said to Mother, what happened to my clowns in the bedroom? And she looked a little uneasy, a little funny. She said, well, we so much, not much room. We had taken them down into the basement. And I said, well, I want to go down there and get them. And then again, she looked a little uncomfortable, and she said, well, we had a flood down there. Well, I didn't like the sound of that, so I ran down the stairs, and I started looking. I started going through boxes. I went through boxes for over an hour. No sign of the clowns. But finally, there was a little orange crate sitting on its small end with a little blue cloth over it that had been made into some kind of a little storage table, and I pulled that cloth back, and there was the pink clown, but its head was missing. And the yellow clown, though I continued to look for another hour, was nowhere to be found. And the grief that I felt on losing the one clown and having the other one badly damaged was disproportionate, because after all, they were just chalk figures that we had $1 invested in. But I felt very badly about it. So I took the headless pink clown home. I felt a little guilty. I felt like I had just ignored them up there and not really taken care of them, and something bad had happened. Well, first I put them in my workroom, put the pink clown in my workroom, but I didn't like looking at it, so I took it out in the shop. It created a pang and a bad feeling every time I saw it, and there it stayed in the shop, keeping a solitary vigil for a number of years. Well, time rolled on, as it does. Mother started having a chest pain, and she had a bad heart condition, was having it checked out at St. Joseph Hospital, had a heart attack, and she ended up moving from McKee to Nicholasville. And every evening I would go over there and visit her. Now, Mother and I, when I was growing up, we used to butt heads quite a bit. But in those last years in Nicholasville, I'd bring her the paper every evening. We kind of mended our relationship, and we grew a lot closer. And if I had to point to one thing, I'd say it was probably her love of antiques and my growing interest in antiques that brought us together, because she would tell me about every piece that she had found and where she got it, and if she paid $5 for it, she remembered everything. And one walnut end table, was very ornate. It was East Lake style. She had paid a big price for it, $35. So we'd talk about that, and gradually as I started getting some pieces, I'd bring them over there to her. And then as time wore on, her balance began to go bad. And she was at risk of falling. So I did a little research, and I got her a very expensive walker. And I brought it to her, and I showed it to her, and said, now you need to use this, because if you fall and break a hip, that wouldn't be good. Well, a number of years later, that's actually what happened. But she would take the walker, and just for my benefit while I was there, she would walk with it, but she wouldn't put it on the floor. She'd carry it, which of course just made it more likely that she'd fall. And her caregivers would tell me that no, she never used it when you weren't there. And so one day I was in, and I said, I never see you using that walker. And I was kind of rebuking her a little bit. I said, I paid a lot of money for that, and you don't even use it. And she said, I do use it. And I said, well, I don't see. And she said, well, it's right now in there in the bedroom. I've got clothes drying on it. So she wasn't going to use the walker. So I got to thinking, what can I do to make it less likely that she'll fall? I've got to do something that she likes, because Mother was very fussy about the house. Finally, I thought if I could get an antique, and I found these walnut carved handles on eBay, and I bought them, and I said, what would you think if I put these up here where you get off the couch? And she said, well, those are pretty, that'd be all right. So that started the string of antique handles, either made out of wood or brass or cast iron. And we ended up, I had 19 handles all around the lower floor of her townhouse, and she'd go around grabbing one, and another looked like she was doing a folk dance. But they kept her stable for many years. Well, during the process, when I would get those on eBay, I typically wouldn't bid on anything. Anything just said buy it now, it lists a price, I'd just buy it. But it did get me on the habit of looking on eBay. And one day I was on there, and I thought to myself, I look at all these antiques, I wonder if they might have any of those carnival clowns. So I entered that, and there was a bunch of clowns of all different kinds. And as I scrolled down, lo and behold, there was one. It was a different color, but it was exactly the same form as the two Daddy and I had won. And there was 2 days left to go on the auction. So there was no question. It wasn't that I wanted it. I had to have it. And so I came up with a strategy. I wasn't going to bid and let the bidding just run up. I was going to wait till about 15 seconds before the time ran out, and then I'd put my bid in so nobody had a chance to top me. Well, that's what I did, and I went in my workroom. I had timed it. I'd set an alarm on my clock, and when it came down, it was to a minute and started ticking off the seconds. As the seconds went down, my heart rate went up, and I was surprised at how agitated I was getting. But I kept with my plan. I put in my price $15 higher than the highest bid. And when we got down to 15 seconds, I tapped it, and then it went into the wheel of death for a little bit, and then the words came up, you are the highest bidder. Oh, I just felt joy flood me. But right on the heels of that, the wheel of death came on again, and another message came up and said, you're not the highest bidder. Oh, no, I got to put in a higher price. So I started trying to type 4, 3, 2, 1. It's ended. I didn't have time, and I lost that clown. Again, the disappointment I felt was keen. But after that, I started searching for those clowns regularly, and before too long, I found another one. Well, I wasn't going to take any chances on this one, and it was a bid auction, but I waited till 8 seconds before it was over before I put my time in, and sure enough, I won it. Well, when it came in, about a week later, it was all bundled up and wrapped in tons of newspaper. Again, the excitement that I felt taking that out was surprising to me, but when I got it out, there it was. Different color and some of the little details, but it was the same mold. The clown was bald. It had a little comical looking hat on its head. Its left hand was kind of tucked in under its arm, and its right hand was holding an ice cream cone. And there it was. So I put it in my music room, and I got the headless pink clown out and set it next to it. And that feeling of loss and sadness that I'd had around the clowns, it went away for about a week. And then after about a week, it started to come back. And I don't know, I'd look at them and I'd say, well, I've got one, but that other one doesn't have a head. And I don't know, I just started feeling that same sadness. And so I got back on eBay and I won another one. Won the auction, and it came in and I unwrapped it. It was a different color. And a few of the details were little. It was fascinating, but the same mold. It was obviously the same company, or a company imitating the same clown. Well, I put it up. Now I had two, plus the pink one with no head. And that feeling of sadness and regret around the clowns went away. This time for maybe about 3 days. I left them up there. I even took a picture of the headless clown. If you can see that, I hope that doesn't give you nightmares, but that's what it looked like. And again, I guess it was a little bit like an addiction. I went back to eBay and I won a third clown. Now I had 3, plus one with no head. But this time, the good feeling only lasted about a day, and you would think I would quit then, but no, I went back over looking for another one, and there wasn't any for quite a while. But finally I found a fourth one and got it, and when it came in, I wasn't quite as excited, and I had 4 of these clowns, plus the headless clown. And suddenly it occurred to me, you're trying to buy what's not for sale. And I realized that no number of these clowns was going to take away the sadness I felt around losing the one that my dad and I had won and having the other one so badly damaged. So I put all 5 of them out in the shop, and I didn't search for clowns anymore. Well, about 7 years ago in 2013, the little baby that was born while I was teaching at Brill Community School, now a grown married woman living in Louisville, Carrie, she came to visit one fall, and she now lived in a 1901 Victorian house where she still lives. And I had a lot of these antique pieces of hardware out in the shop, hooks and hinges and handles, things like that, drawer pulls. And I thought she might want some of those for her Victorian house, so we went out there and I was showing her some. And she got to noticing up on the tallest shelf, and she said, "What are all those clowns doing up there?" Well, I told her the story of the clowns, and she looked at that. She said, "Well, you know yours that doesn't have a head." She said, "I could make it a head." And I thought, why didn't I think of that? Because Carrie is an artist. She's a painter, and she's a 3D artist in ceramics and other forms of clay. So I said, yes, please make it a head. And so she took it back with her to Louisville. And in about a month I was down there, and she said, "Well, let me show you the clown." And so she brought it out, and here it was. And she had made a head for it. It wasn't headless anymore. And I thought that its head had a much more character than the other ones. See, this clown's got that kind of weary wisdom that the carnies had, but this guy, he's just a clown. So that made a real difference. My clown had been repaired. And so I put it in the workroom with the other clowns. Now I had 5 complete clowns. And that did heal that feeling of sadness and loss that I had about what had happened to the clowns. Almost completely. But there was still a little tinge of that. It wasn't exactly like what Dad and I had won. Well, by then it was winter, and it wasn't long until Christmas was here. And we were all at the house. Now, in the Norris family, we're not big on surprise gifts. We like to get what we want to get. So we give these little Christmas hints. So Christmas is kind of an unwrapping of what you know you're going to get. Now I'm cold-natured, so I got my long underwear, my long sleeve t-shirts, and my jackets and so on, and gloves. And I had gotten everything that I thought I had coming, but then Carrie, my daughter, came out with this little beautifully wrapped box, and I unwrapped it, and lo and behold, what was in there but another clown. But this time a small one. She had had some extra clay left from when she made a head for the pink clown, and she had made and painted a yellow clown, but a small one, and I loved it. It was even better than the others, and here it is. And just like the two clowns originally sat on the walnut dresser and kept guard, now the little Christmas clown sits on an antique walnut shelf in the workroom and kind of keeps watch over me and the Mommy Goose figures as we do our work. And that really did heal the feeling of loss and sadness I had around the clowns. Of course, I realized, obviously, the two clowns, who were the two clowns? Well, that was me and my dad. And that was something that we did together, and that was a success. And just like I lost one of the clowns, and the other one was badly damaged, and that's what happened. I lost my father, and that took a piece out of me, and there'll always be some sadness about that. But about the clowns themselves, that really healed that. So for this Christmas, I hope you get an unexpected present that brings joy and healing. And while I realize that there are a lot of bad clowns out there, I wanted you to know that there's some good ones too. So let's hope that this is a Christmas that brings joy and healing and leads to joy and healing maybe around the world. So let me close with a musical note, so to speak. And just speaking on behalf of myself and the clowns and Carmen, just say, we wish you a Merry Christmas, we wish you a Merry Christmas, we wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. And a healthy one too. Bye-bye.